Hi, welcome to the course on Patanjali's Yoga Sutra. This is Gayatri. Today we'll be studying Sutra number 2, but first a small prayer. Om Yogena Chittasya Padena Vacha Malam Sharirasya Chavedyakena Yopakarotam Pravaram Muninam Patanjalim Pranjalaranatosmi. The second sutra. Yogaschitta Vritti Nirodha. We'll begin with Maharsi Veda Vyasa. In his commentary as interpreted by Professor Ganganath Jha, the second sutra is translated as Yoga is the inhibition of the functions of the mind. So, before we sort of dive into it, I just wanted to say, as much as the Yogasutras themselves are supposed to be the simplified version of instruction on yoga, Patanjali basically condensed the information on yoga that existed before he did this. And even so, the commentaries on it can make them feel quite dense and complicated, mainly because a lot of the writers and commentators use an older tradition of words which are bombastic and which are extremely loaded in meaning. For instance, you cannot say chitta without parsing it into 10 different sections. And there's an assumption that there is a basic amount of knowledge in the reader or listener. However, it is by navigating these that we can make sense of the teaching. And one of the reasons for this is because this is the nature of Tantra. That we must seek sufficiently for the knowledge to reveal itself. So grappling with the text is part of the process. So don't let larger words or hidden meanings sort of put you off. Okay. So in Professor Ganganath Jha's commentary, he points out that the sutra does not mention all the functions of the mind are to be inhibited, just that the functions of the mind are to be inhibited. Why so? For this, he says, Maharsi Vyasa explains the components of the mind: truth, inertia, and energy. And this I find is one of the simplest explanations of the gunas: truth, energy, and inertia. This is the simplest way to understand these three: sattva, rajas, tamas. We remain either in knowledge, sattva, or we get mixed up in the sense objects, tamas, or we crave power, rajas. When we are under the influence of rajas and tamas, we have the distracted state of mind. When we are under the influence of tamas alone, we have attachment, delusion, helplessness. Professor Jha uses the word sin here, which I'm not sure is the correct translation, since the traditional texts don't really have a concept of sin. It's more a sort of Western overview on Indian texts. However, he's not provided the original term here, so I'm just going to let that pass. Basically, the tamas state of mind is mired in lust and wanting and acquires the dull and fickle states of mind. These are what he described in Sutra 1 as Kshipita, Mudha, and Vikshipita. You can, as I said, go back to Sutra 1 to listen to those categories again. And you'll see how cleverly the knowledge builds on the previous one like an interlocking loop. And you'll notice the structure with all the great masters, including the Buddha. The teaching builds such that if you miss one nugget of information, you have to go back and, correct the previous step. But it's a very canny way of teaching because the student knows exactly until where he knows what he knows. And so it's very easy to go back and correct your knowledge. And the dissemination of knowledge is designed in such a way that if you haven't got a certain step right, the next step won't make sense to you. So do go back if you need to. So in the distracted state of mind, whatever communion or yoga you attain is not yoga, because the yoga is subjugated to the distraction. When the mind shakes off the tamas, It has the drive towards virtue. Okay? So let's say you shake off that distracted state of mind. You still have the drive. You need to say, okay, I need to get up and go and do my yoga or seek my knowledge or work towards my liberation. And that is still ego invested in being virtuous. And it has the taint of rajas because you need the drive. So, when the rajas is excessive, I would think of this kind of like the mind state of Ravana, who, though he was a great yogi, was imbalanced by the powerful rajas mind. When even the slightest bit of rajas is thrown off, the sattva mind, consisting of pure knowledge, turns towards true yoga. Consciousness by itself is unchanging. Veda Vyasa points out that this is different from discriminative knowledge, which may also be sattvic, but is still focused on the discerning faculty of the mind. These are highly technical phrases, the discerning mind, the discriminative mind. Don't let it throw you off. As you read through the 6 bhashyas, as each master explains it, it will become clearer and clearer. So just hang in there. Okay, so the discriminative knowledge, okay, is still using the discerning faculty of the mind. This is still in the state of sampragnata or concrete knowledge. What is he saying? He's saying that a mind that uses the mind to know the mind is still in the concrete state. Okay, so for instance, when you sit down for meditation and you say, now I will concentrate, the will and the concentrate are also faculties of the mind. So let's say you're coming to concentration by chanting Ram, 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 or whatever it is you chant. Okay? You're still using the mind to know the mind. And therefore you are still within the known ambit of the mind. Okay? Only when it shuts this also out, and hence all its functions, inhibiting discerning also, it is in a state of seedless communion, that is without potential for rebirth, and thus reaches asampragnata or the abstract communion. Both together, asampragnata and sampragnata, concrete and abstract, form the state of the inhibited mind. Professor Jha explains that if all functions are inhibited in the sutra, then conscious communion would be excluded. However, the definition of all functions are also included as it activates the mind still. Only when this is surpassed, we reach the abstract. So I'll summarize this for you. I know this was a little complicated. Generally, Veda Vyasa direct is. Okay. So to summarize, Rajas and Tamas in equal measure is distracted mind or vikshipita. Tamas alone is fickle and dull mind, kshipita and mudha. Sattva with a tinge of rajas is ekagra mind, because you still need the drive to move yourself towards liberation. Sattva mind that is inhibited is nirodha. Nirodha mind is still sampragnata. When you use the mind to conquer the mind, you are still in the state of the concrete. Only when all functions of the mind are inhibited, it reaches asampragnata or abstract mind. That is when you have crossed the gunas. Okay, that is the commentary by Maharsi Veda Vyasa, direct as interpreted by Professor Ganganath Jha. Now let's go to Swami Satyananda, and I'm sorry to be developing a clear favorite, but I find Swami Satyananda's explanations just systematic, simple, and very beautiful. Consciousness, vritti, patterns, nirodha, blocking. Simply put, to block the patterns of consciousness is yoga. And he says, don't take this as a definition as such of yoga, because you cannot define yoga until you have studied all 195 sutras. So don't get into, is this the definition of yoga? So he defines the terms. He breaks down the terms for us instead. Chitta comes from chit, to see, be conscious of, be aware. Chitta becomes the individual consciousness, which includes the subconscious and the unconscious mind. All three together form chitta. He deconstructs these in another way. Objective consciousness, which is what we gain through the senses, subjective consciousness, astral plane, unconsciousness, or the dormant personality, dormant self. He recommends that you read the Mandukya Upanishad for details on the 4 dimensions of consciousness. Chitta includes these 3, which I've just described: objective, subjective, and unconscious. Plus the Atman becomes the 4th. So these together, the Chitta plus Atman, becomes the 4 dimensions of consciousness. So he gives you a formula. He says Jivatman minus Chitta is Atman. Okay? So there is a Purusha form, minus Chitta is Atman, Prakriti. If you think of Chitta as only mind, okay, blocking or inhibition seems like suppression. But if you understand that Chitta is whole consciousness, all of awareness, all 3 stages, then Nirodha cannot be suppressing, because that would mean lacking awareness. Hence, it is important to understand what it is we block. We block the habitual patterns of Chitta and not awareness itself. He points out, for instance, in a state of meditation, you will notice that the patterns of consciousness falls away. Okay? What this sutra is telling you, that it is fundamentally possible to achieve a different state of mind. How? By inhibiting the habitual state of mind. When the flow of vrittis change, let's say you're asleep, you enter a different mind state. So it is in manipulating these vrittis that altered states occur. There's a definite process to it. And if you follow the process, you can achieve an altered state of mind. What is this process? It is separate from body, mind, senses, prana, and it lies in awareness. It is awareness that alters from state to state. Okay? So your dream state or your supraconscious state, your body, mind, senses, prana may be inactive, but your awareness is traveling. And a conscious transition of awareness is what confers us that alteration. Consciousness exists in the body. It cannot exist without the body. And yet it has to be blocked. Not ordinary thought, which is negligible. So basically what he says is don't worry about this running train of the mind. Okay? Ordinary thought, feelings, emotions, passions, desires, all this stuff that we keep grappling with at the mundane level, it really doesn't matter. Because there's a whole area of consciousness beyond it that is fascinating. It's beyond the body, within the body, outside the body, and it is infinite. The consciousness is what travels from life to life. So, in this life we tend to think our thoughts, our memories, our ideas are really the biggest thing. But you are so limited by those thoughts and ideas in this life. It is only within the frame of the known. Okay? They don't affect the larger flow of consciousness. So also what we use yoga for is to raise the level of our grappling. What we are blocking is the pattern of chitta, which is its pattern of remanifesting. So, vritta means circle. Vritti is circular. The chitta's patterns are circular. They recur, they ripple, they turn like a wheel. Hence, the modes of the mind are chitta vritti. So, when we block, what are we blocking? We block consciousness from falling into the pattern of recurring and transcending the individual experiences in the different planes. This is the order of evolution of your consciousness, he says. Okay? He then explains the 5 stages of evolutions of consciousness and also encourage you to, find this chapter and read it yourself, because it's just beautifully explained and it's unlikely that I'm going to do justice to it, but I will try. The Muda state belongs to the Muladhara chakra. Okay, so Muda is dullness of mind, where the individual consciousness is sleeping. When it awakens, when it's sleeping, that's what they refer to in Kundalini as the sleeping serpent. When it awakens and rises up to Manipura, that is the navel, it reaches Kshipita, or fickle mind. Between Manipura and Muladhara, okay, the state of mind can go back and forth. But if you have successfully stayed in Manipura, the navel chakra, then consciousness has the capacity to become relatively steady in its ascent as Vikshipita up to the Ajna chakra. Then you start to see real progress in concentration. And Sahasrahara at the crown is beyond the three gunas. So all the world becomes an interplay of these three gunas. Sattva, Tamas and Rajas permeate all creation, and they have an interplay which manifests through action, thought and event. When Sattva predominates, the mind is quiet. When Tamas predominates, nothing can make you active or blissful. And Swami Satyananda says one guna alone does not predominate but interacts with the others in proportion. So the tamas dominance is suppressing the other two and puts you in inertia, and thinking becomes slow and creates this deep neurosis that becomes mudha, a dullness state of chitta. So you see how it's all interlinked. When rajas predominates, suppressing sattva and tamas, the mind is scattered. And, he says at this point you can be suicidal, murderous in the state of kshipita. Vikshipita is an oscillating mind. Sometimes steady, sometimes distracted. It's like, when you sit down to meditate and you just can't get your mind to focus. When the flow of concentration that is born of sattva is interrupted by unsteadiness, born of rajas, one is in vikshipita. So you may start a meditation program, yoga, fitness program, start your work, be very steady for a few days and then, leave everything for a few days. But he says, so this is a fickle state of mind. But he says this is a very important stage because the gunas over here are expressing themselves freely. And this is where yoga begins. In this free expressive state, when sattva expresses itself, one-pointedness dawns. So, when you understand which guna is dominant in the moment, you understand how to eliminate the negative qualities that it's bringing out so that all three regain balance. You don't eliminate the gunas. You bring them back to balance with countermeasures. So, for instance, if you're awake at night and you can't sleep, then you use monotony, chanting, you repeat a name. This reduces your rajas. Okay? You apply a repetitive element, tamasic element, to invoke sleep. So, in this way, whatever, a guna is dominant, when you start observing yourself and you start understanding which guna is predominating, you can apply the countermeasure, and therefore you keep bringing yourself back to balance. So yoga, he says, begins at vikshipita when the gunas start manifesting in different forms through you freely. In ekagra, once you reach ekagra, rajas and tamas are absent, only sattva remains. When you surpass that and you arrive at nirodha, neither tamas, rajas nor sattva remain, and you achieve trigunatita, which is beyond the three gunas. This is equivalent to the awakening of the kundalini energy. Now we'll move to Swami Vivekananda. So, Swami Vivekananda really enjoys Sutra too. He really gets under the skin of it. Okay, so he says this is a very important sutra. And he says, what is chitta, what is vritti? Interestingly, he uses it, he explains it in the same sort of terms that the Buddha used. I and I consciousness, except he says that there is the instrument and there is the organ and the mind attachment. what do they mean by this, both the Buddha and Swami Vivekananda? So when you see something, you see through the organ of the instrument of the eye. The occipital center in your brain is the instrument. It's the mind attachment. Okay? But what is seen? It is not the eye that is seeing. It is eye consciousness. So that is what Swami Vivekananda explains as instrument, organ, and mind attachment. Okay? So the organ would be the eye, the instrument is the eye consciousness, and then you have the mind attachment. The mind takes it further to the buddhi, the intellect, which reacts, activating the ego center, the ahankara. This action I see, okay? This action reaction is presented to the real soul, the Purusha, okay? And the organs, the indriyas, together with the mind, manas, determination, buddhi, and ego, ahankara, become a group called the antakarana. These together are the processes of the chitta. The whirlpool of the mind, he says, is the vritti. Think of thought as a gravitational force or repulsion of this pool. When the force is propelled by chitta, its output is thought. Okay? And in case this has got a little dense, I'll explain it to you. Say you're looking at something. Your eye consciousness is seeing through the organ and creates a mind attachment. The mind takes it to the buddhi, which reacts, activating the sense of ego, I see. The action reaction is presented to the real soul, the Purusha, okay? And the organs, together with the mind, the sense organs, along with the manas, buddhi, ego, become a group called antakarana, and these form the chitta. The chitta has a sort of, is the whirlpool of the mind, is the vritti. And the vritti is creating this sort of force. Its output is thought and motion. So as this whirlpool of the mind is churning, that force that is created drives your motion, and in the subtler form, it drives thought. Where does this force come from? This force comes from food. From here it gets the power of motion, and the subtler forces become thought. Hence, he says, the mind is not intelligent on its own. It only appears to be because of the Purusha behind it, the real self. You are the sentient being. The mind is the instrument channeling you towards the external world. The universe thus becomes a reaction of the mind. Okay, just as the pearl comes into being out of the irritation of the oyster with a grain of sand, the mind is throwing enamel over it. Okay, and I do suspect he's channeling William Blake here. So what he says is, as ordinary men, we don't get this, because every time we try to try to sort of analyze what is this grain of sand, the mind is throwing out more enamel and covering up the sand and presenting it to us as a pearl. And this is the patterning in the vrittis. You see, because we cannot use the mind to know the mind beyond a point, because the mind is the creator of the illusion. The real man is behind the mind. The mind is the instrument, and his intelligence percolates through it. So when the mind is calm, we see behind it. Just like, when the lake is calm and free of ripples, we see the bottom. The ripples being vrittis, the lake being chitta, and the bottom being the true self. He describes the three states of mind as tamas, darkness, okay, which is the state of brutes and idiots, his words, not mine, who harm others. Rajas, whose chief motives are to enjoy power and rule over others. And the clear lake attains sattva, serenity. But he points out serenity is not inactive. It is intensely active. It is the greatest manifestation of the power to be calm. And it is harder to be calm than to be active. So do not mistake sattva for dullness. It is restraint, it is not dullness. Activity, he says, is the manifestation of lower strength, calmness of superior strength. Chitta keeps trying to return to its primal state, but the organs keep drawing it out. And this first step of yoga is to get it on the journey. And this is only possible in the human form. Though chitta is in all animals, it is only when it has this sort of interpreter, the catalyst of the intellect, okay, that, that we can use the chitta. Okay, it manifests in scattering, darkening, awakening, concentrating. Scattering is activity, manifests as pleasure and pain. Dullness is darkness, which injures others, the demonical form. And ekagra is what brings us to samadhi. This is Swami Vivekananda. Now, let's get into B.K.S. Iyengar's explanation. He is also extremely systematic. He gives you the breakdown of the words first, and he explains it very differently. So for him, yoga as union of what? From the outermost muscle and bone to the innermost self. Right? The consciousness with 3 stages of the mind. Manas, buddhi and ahankara, chitta being the vehicle of observation, attention, aims and reason. And chitta has 3 functions, he says, cognition, volition and motion. And vritti being the state of mind, fluctuations, behavior, the state of being. Nirodha being obstruction. So yoga, he says, is defined as the restraint of fluctuations in the consciousness. When we study the behavior of consciousness, we see it has 3 functions: cognition, volition, motion. Yoga helps us quieten their movements to a state of silence, which becomes the seat of consciousness. And yoga is the discipline by which we culture and mature the mind. So chitta is the vehicle which takes the mind, manas, to the Atman, soul. Yoga seizes the vibrations in its seat so that this journey may happen. He describes chitta as the subtlest form of cosmic intelligence, Mahat, which is the source of Prakriti, the physical world itself, as opposed to the soul, which is its offshoot. Listen to what he says. He says chitta is the progenitor of the world of nature itself. The soul is only an offshoot of it. And in the Sankhya system, Purusha and Prakriti mingling creates the world, the source of all action, volition, and silence. Basically, every phenomenon that has reached a state of complete evolution is going to have a subtle side. So thus, buddhi or discrimination is the gross counterpart of the subtle Mahat. Chitta is the gross form of Chit. In order for liberation to happen, the highest form of consciousness must work with the highest form of intellect. And these are linked by the antakarna, the mind stuff, ego, intelligence, manobuddhi, ahankara. So this antakarna is cloudy due to entanglement with worldly engagement. And what does a sadhaka do on the path of yoga is aim to purify it. Consciousness is what links the manifest to the unmanifest, the evolved to the unevolved, and it is also closest to the soul. So, how does this happen? The buddhi presents perfect action and experience, and the mind, the manas, must use the jnanendriyas, the 5 senses of perception, that is sight, sound, smell, all of that. The karmendriyas, which are a product of the elements of nature with their 5 senses. And the 5 sheaths or koshas are also within the 5 elements of nature. Okay? So what B.K.S. Iyengar does is he's basically pointing out to you, you have 5 senses of perception. You have 5 sense organs. You have 5 sheaths, the koshas. You have 5 elements of nature. And these are each and all manifestations of the chitta which use each other to cognize the world and to also deconstruct the world. So the same instrument that is making manifest the world to you is the same instrument that is demanifesting it to you. Yoga thus integrates the person between the states of the external to the internal, from intelligence of skin to intelligence of self, and thus Prakriti and Purusha become merged. So his explanation is absolutely profound and beautiful. What he's basically saying is there is a complete state of harmony between the external world and the internal world. And this realization is the merging of Prakriti and Purusha. Yoga, he says, leads to a sattvic state, but to restrain, to force yourself to have this imposition of will to reach there requires a subtle element of rajas. So when you flow from dharana to dhyana, that is from concentration to meditation, the sadhaka is basically uniting the individual to the universal. And the object of meditation goes from individual self to the universal self. When the mind is focused on objects, it fluctuates. When the mind is focused on the individual self, it becomes steady. So when the discrimination faculty clearly distinguishes individual self from objects, the source of fluctuation ceases. Why is that discrimination not always possible? Because of this elemental integration. You see? Yoga becomes the means of restraining the fluctuations by detaching the mind from the sense objects and locating it back to the self, the object of dharana. Yoga, therefore, becomes a means and an end. B.K.S. Iyengar's explanation is beautiful because it's completely integrated with our understanding of the world and the way the mind draws out the world from the body, from the perception, from the senses, from the indriyas, from the koshas, as well as subsumes it all back into it. So to him, yoga is this perfect state of harmony between all the elemental forms of Prakriti and Purusha, manifest, unmanifest, evolved and unevolved. Yoga is thus both a means and an end, he said. Now we move to the explanation of Osho. Osho uses the most Buddhist terms in all the bhashyas. He says yoga is the cessation of the mind. And cessation is a word that, comes from the Buddha's Four Noble Truths. And this is the best definition you have, he says, because it is the most scientific. The mind covers everything: ego, desires, hopes, philosophies, religion, scriptures. All that you can think of, all that lends itself to being knowable is mind. Hence, cessation of mind is the cessation of the known. It is jumping into the unknown and the unknowable. What is mind? We think of it as something substantial. Patanjali, Osho says, doesn't agree. Science also doesn't agree. Mind is a function, an entity. It is not a thing. The example he gives is very simple. He says, you walk. I see you are walking. But when you sit down, where does your walking go? So also the mind is minding. It is thinking. And he tells a great story. The great sage Bodhidharma went to China. The emperor is waiting for him. And he says, tell me how to put my mind at ease. So Bodhidharma says, do nothing. First, bring your mind to me. Come at 4 o'clock in the morning. Tell no one. Bring your mind with you. And the emperor thinks, what's wrong with this guy? Is he mad? Bring my mind with me, don't forget. And he couldn't sleep, but he goes at 4 a.m. And Bodhidharma asks, where is your mind? Have you brought it with you or not? And the emperor says, listen, don't talk nonsense. When I'm here, my mind is here. It's not something I can forget somewhere. So Bodhidharma says, okay, so we have determined the mind is within you And the emperor says, okay, the mind is within me. So Bodhidharma says, okay, quickly locate it and let me know where it is so I can set it at peace. Give it to me. The emperor closes his eyes and then he soon, realizes the absurdity of the quest. He says, if it's not something, if the mind is not something, nothing can be done about it. If it's an activity, don't do the activity. If it's like walking, then don't walk. So he opens his eyes and he tells Bodhidharma, there is no mind to be found. And Bodhidharma says, okay, then I have put it at peace. Looking for mind, Osho says, is anti-mind. Because a look is not thinking. To look intensely, when you go into this self-observation mode, you utilize your whole energy, you take it away from motion and thought and put it into thinking. So yoga, being the cessation of the mind, requires this or is the process of this looking. If your mind is thinking when you're doing asanas, you are not in yoga. So you can do yoga for many lives. When the mind is there, you are there. When the activity of the mind has ceased, like clouds disappearing from the sky, there is cessation. The word Zen, he explains, comes from the word dhyana, which becomes jhan, as in jhanas. Those of you who jhanas are basically the states of meditation. In China, it becomes chan, and in Japan, Zen. And the root of it is the same, dhyana, which means no mind. So the whole training is how to stop minding, simply be, without thinking. When Patanjali says cessation, your mind cannot be chanting Ram, Ram, Ram because it is still using its faculty of thought. It's still using the chitta. So how do we stop? Patanjali says, simply look, let the mind do what it has to do. It flows because of the past momentum, just don't go along with it. Yoga is the cessation of the mind, then the witness is established in itself. And this is what is explained in Sutra 3. Now we'll be reading Barbara Stoller Miller, highly erudite, extremely contextual in how she explains, and she makes interesting comparisons. Barbara Stoller Miller makes a comparison between the Eightfold Path of Buddha, the Bhagavad Gita, of which she is an excellent scholar. I hope you've read her poetic translation of the Gita, and the Yogasutras for their common store of knowledge. Two striking examples of this commonality, she says, are the use of two terms, Nirodha and Chittavritti Nirodha, which she translates as cessations of the turnings of thought, as the Buddha explained it. Further, she adds the idea of dukkha, that all is suffering for the wise man, Sutra 2.15, which we'll look into a bit later. At the time Buddhism was developing, yoga was, manifesting in texts such as the Mahabharata, in which the most powerful practitioner of it is Arjuna. Okay? And in more than one episode, she points out, Arjuna performs feats of yogic austerity, including in the dialogue on the battlefield. The battlefield setting, she says, is not just a physical place, but a state of mind. And as Arjuna loses his nerve at the thought of, having to kill his family, go to war against elders, Krishna is teaching him to discipline thought and emotion, to perform the necessary action free from bloodlust and pain. And the path to this is through psychological and physical discipline, concentration, meditation, and contemplative awareness. Okay? Essentially yoga. And she points out one crucial distinction between the yoga of Lord Krishna and the yoga that Patanjali teaches. In the Gita, Krishna teaches liberation as the aim of yoga, in order to enable one to wage war in life. Okay? Patanjali teaches it as a complete cessation of worldly concerns. So, yoga in the Gita has friendship, devotion, action as transformational forces. But in Patanjali's exposition on yoga, there is a suspension of mental and physical action is necessary. Ishvara in Patanjali is not a creator god. He's not a manifestation of life and death. He's rather an archetypal yogi, a sort of object of concentration. And in Patanjali, there is no manifestation like Krishna, as the form of Mahavishnu. And this is because the Sankhya text Sankhya Karika is a complement and parallel structure to the Yogasutras. And yoga as a code of practical discipline is amplified by the Sankhya ideal of cosmic evolution, the psychological mirroring in the microcosm, basically the Purusha and the Prakriti. The basis of spiritual liberation in yoga is a profound experience of the evolutionary process. So, like a point in Euclidean geometry, she says, spirit has no material identity except in relation to the phenomenal world. It is through ignorance, according to Patanjali, that spirit is connected to the world. Because of this ignorance, Purusha is manifested as Prakriti. Okay? Alone it is pure consciousness. All material nature consists of, therefore, the three gunas, the aspects of energy in potential form, and actualized in innumerable combinations in the material world. Sattva is lucidity, passion is rajas, tamas is inertia, which weighs down the other two. And among the 24 evolutes of Sankhya theory, Patanjali focuses on those that must be broken down to open the gross and subtle fetters of thought. Since what binds the spirit to the material world, since what binds the spirit to the material world is made of the same material. What binds Purusha to Prakriti is consciousness, Chitta. And the material world is made of Chitra. So how do you clear the fog with the fog? Right? So we are bound by what we are escaping, essentially. Chitta is a combination of three psychomental evolutes. Together with the five sense organs, Chitta functions through individual cognition and emotion. Unlike Manas, the mind, the organ of thought, which it is often misidentified as. So, what she's basically saying here is that Chitta Vritti comprises all states of consciousness. Okay? And thought in the material world is ceaselessly in motion. And the goal of yoga is to still this motion, and therefore, by doing so, to liberate the subject from the tyranny of uncontrollable thought. However, since the mind is also material in nature, tranquility itself is not enough to ensure ultimate freedom. Why? Because it cannot discriminate between what is essential and what is adventitious. So, tranquility that you're creating through yoga, through a state of meditation, or through the things you do to become tranquil, like taking a walk in nature, or whatever it is, the tranquility is also a function of the mind, and therefore it cannot last. The body and mind, according to Patanjali, are the physical and mental dimensions of the same material nature, Prakriti. Interior nature is much more difficult to control than external. So when you control the inner, the external aspects become easier to control. And that's why the yogi gains extraordinary powers, because he's controlling the inner and he's controlling the outer through the inner. So Purusha becomes bound to Prakriti, spirit to material nature through Chitta and the accumulation of subliminal memory, samskara, vasana, ashaya. The relation between Chitta Vritti and memory, she says, is essential to Patanjali's epistemology. When thought passes from one state to another, it is preserved in memory and becomes a storehouse of thoughts. If you study Buddhism, you will recognize this as sankharas, which are stored in the alaya, or the storehouse of the mind consciousness. And then she goes on a beautiful exposition on the connection between thought and memory in Sanskrit literature, which I'm not going to get into, but I encourage you to read it. But for our purpose, she says Patanjali aggregates the expression of chitta through karma. And this accounts for subconscious predispositions that condition an individual through many lives. Okay, so when the mind acts through karma, it creates action in the world. Okay, and this creates conditions for us through many lives. And therefore, thought and action become a cyclical causality. Action creates memory traces which fuel mental processes. It is stored in memory, and therefore it endures many births. And this storehouse is only obliterated when the chain of causal relations is broken. Even so, memory, reason, intuition. So there is this cyclical causality of thought, action in the world that creates memory, that goes into the storehouse. And you need to obliterate that through yoga. But even so, even if you obliterate it, or even if you don't, memory, reason, intuition have no relevance to spiritual liberation. Why? Because if you remember what Swami Satyananda said, and also to some extent what B.K.S. Iyengar said, these are limited to this framework, to the known framework of this life. You need to aim higher, because the thing that's running through all the lives is higher than chitta. So liberation is possible only when the subconscious subliminal impressions are consumed and all turning cease. If you remember what Professor Ganganath Jha said, why does it not use the word all turning cease? Liberation is not the cessation of the world of sensory input, provocations, actions, thought, memory, but detachment from them. So as you go through this world, you're going to use your emotion, you're going to use thought, you're going to use memory, you're going to act, you're going to perform karmas. That is not what needs to cease. You don't need to go and sit in the corner like a immobile statue. That does not make you liberated. Detachment from all of that and the cessation of chitta, which runs through many lifetimes, is what moves you towards liberation. So this is a conclusion of the second sutra, Yogaschitta Vritti Nirodha, and I hope it helps you understand the words of these masters. What is it that actually has to cease? Thank you for listening, and I hope you'll join us next week for Sutra number 3. Also request to please like, share, subscribe, as it helps the information and the knowledge reach many people who may need it. Thank you.